Hello and welcome to Redaction Report. So this is going to be a brand new show that we're doing on a weekly basis. We're going to be having a news roundup show. So this is going to differ slightly from our other podcasts, which have been sort of more analysis, more opinion driven. This is just going to be sort of a weekly news roundup, just go through all the talking points and some major news events going on around the world. We're going to kick off today with a couple of really big stories that have gone on in the past week. These are, of course, the Taliban's recapturing of much of Afghanistan and the IPCC climate report that declared code red for humanity. So a couple of really cheerful topics to be kicking off our first edition of this. Let's start with Afghanistan, shall we? Because this is a very much an unfolding situation as we're recording. We're recording this on the evening of Sunday, the 15th of August, 2021. At time of recording, the current president of Afghanistan has fled. He's fled, I believe, to Tajikistan. Basically, the government of Afghanistan has fallen, and the Taliban look like they are set to reclaim Afghanistan. Of course, they controlled the country between 1996 and 2001, up to the US invasion of Afghanistan. Obviously, the Taliban have a reputation for being a massively repressive group. Obviously, massively bad news for women in Afghanistan. There were also acts of, cultural vandalism under the Taliban. So this could be a really dark time for the people of Afghanistan, and Redaction Report stands in full solidarity with the people of Afghanistan. Declan, what have you made being the main talking points out of the fall of Kabul?
It's been surprising, I think, for many people how fast it's taken place. It seems to be only within the last few weeks a lot of the figures on the West were, ardent in their support of the Afghan army, of how it would be able to stand up against the Taliban insurgents. But really, within a really short time frame, we're talking really a matter of weeks here. It seems many of the key cities in Afghanistan have fallen to the insurgents with, what seems like very little resistance, really. So I think that's got to be a really worrying thing after the US-led coalition, which went into Afghanistan, spent so long and spent so much on training the Afghan security forces to protect exactly against something like that. They've been building up to this moment really for years. They put a lot into it. So I think that's going to be a massive disappointment, first of all, for the West. The fact that it's been able to happen so easily, and I think there'll be big questions raised about that. And of course, we've got to mention as well that the people in Afghanistan who were working with the US-led, forces and coalition there. We've got to think about their safety now. Obviously, a number of them have been evacuated to the United States. Obviously, that's something which is ongoing at the moment, but there are going to be people in there who are now going to be in grave danger because of that. And it does beg the question, what does that say to the world when a US-led force has gone in there and possibly left a lot of people in a really dangerous situation now? So, it's really not looking good for them at the minute.
Of course, a lot of people have been drawing comparisons between the fall of Kabul and the fall of Saigon back in the 70s. The US leaving Vietnam, some would say with its tail between its legs, failed to defeat North Vietnam, defeat the communist forces. And of course, Vietnam was reunified under the communist regime of North Vietnam. Tom, what have you made of the fall of Kabul?
Well, literally, it's just come up that the US secretary had said it's manifestly not Saigon, which just means everyone is now saying, oh yeah, it definitely is like Saigon then. Just to repeat what Declan said, it's the speed of it that happened. When it doesn't feel like that long ago that we first heard about the withdrawal. And then some people were like, oh, well, maybe there could be a resurgence. Maybe there will be like a balkanization of Afghanistan where different regions fall into the Taliban and it's a slow growing process, but it's just happened so fast. And I think it took 3 years, I think, after the Soviets left in the 90s. The state that was left then lasted 3 years before the Taliban were able to take control of it. So the speed with which this is, I mean, like it's done essentially. You know, the Taliban are in the presidential palace in Kabul reportedly. So, you know, this is a done deal now. And the international community is treating it as such. You know, they're talking about getting people out because it's a done deal. I guess the thing that will probably take longer now than the actual you know, regime change is how this new state settles in to like the world stage, because obviously all eyes are on it now. Russia and China have been in talks with the Taliban for quite some time. You know, they both have seats on the UN Security Council, so they can veto any actions that could be taken against the new state. So, you know, we'll just see. Will we see a return to, you know, obviously the really harsh conditions under the Taliban in the late 90s, you know, the massive amounts of repression of women, the very strict enforcement of Islamic dress code. Reportedly, it's been somewhat lax in the places where they've already taken control, but, you know, it's very early days. And obviously it's terrifying if you're there, especially if you're a woman, if you're an educated woman. I think it was the Taliban that were responsible for the shooting of Malala, who was obviously quite very famous for standing up for the right to be educated. You know, that's probably all going to slide away, if not initially, then definitely over the coming months and years, depending on how long this lasts. So yeah, the future is very scary, and probably the thing that's going to take longer to unfold now than the actual coup.
Of course, the US has had troops stationed in Afghanistan for the best part of 20 years now. A lot of people have been criticizing President Biden for the move to go ahead with the withdrawal, saying this has left the people of Afghanistan vulnerable and that the Afghan army was not ready to face the Taliban insurgency without NATO and US support. Do we agree with this?
He's in a hard place, isn't he? Because domestically, I mean, you know, time will tell, but domestically, I can imagine it could be quite a popular move for him, because this is America's, you know, sort of never-ending war almost. It is really similar to Vietnam War in terms of the fact that it just seems to have gone on forever. This, you know, I remember 9/11, the invasion of Afghanistan, when I was much younger, and it's almost been like throughout my entire life, this has been going on. And I think a generation of Americans have grown up with that. And when Biden said that he didn't want to send another generation of Americans into that situation, I understand why he's saying that. You know, it's a horrific situation to be in. But then again, when you think about the consequences of what's happening, you know, those troops leaving, it's led to the complete collapse of the country. Many of the things that Tom's mentioned already, the way you know, we know the Taliban have treated minorities and women in the past, being turned away from education, you know, sex trafficking is pretty horrific. So it almost begs the question, like, you know, the Taliban are now trying to almost present themselves as Taliban 2.0. I've seen posted about on social media as this kind of further developed Taliban now. They're not going to be as repressive as they once were. But, you know, my question would be, well, why should we trust them for the things they've done in the past? You know, but going back to the question, it's a really tough one for Biden to do that. You know, he wants America to be back on the world stage, and I think many people will be slightly puzzled by this, but as I said, I think it could turn out to be quite a popular domestic move for him. But yeah, we'll have to see. It's going to be interesting how it unfolds over the next few months, really.
Of course, I think one of the big distinctions to make between Vietnam and Afghanistan, though, is there was less of a mass anti-war movement in the early 2000s against Afghanistan and against the Iraq War than there were against Vietnam. Obviously, there were demonstrations around the world against the Iraq War, but, you know, we just think of like the 60s and 70s opposition to the Vietnam War. We saw nothing of that nature. Think about all the anti-war music that was coming out at the time. I mean, where was that in during the early 2000s? Probably the closest thing we had to a proper anti-war protest popular song would have been American Idiot. And, you know, if the biggest protest song is coming from Green Day, you've got to ask yourself some questions. But yeah, so we'll have to see, of course. The situation is very rapidly unfolding in Afghanistan. We'll be keeping an eye on it. We'll have plenty of content on the subject coming up on Redaction, that you can be sure of. But one of the other big stories, of course, this week was the warning from the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, that humanity has hit, code red on climate change. We've seen some pretty horrifying images coming out of countries like Greece with mass wildfires wreaking absolute havoc. And we've seen the hottest temperature ever recorded in Europe was recorded, I believe it was in Sicily this week. So, climate change is not an issue that's going to go away. What were your reactions to the IPCC's declaration? Because I know a lot of people, of course, were quite alarmed by it and quite scared. And people were saying, this is very alarmist from the IPCC. But I think that's kind of the point, isn't it? We should be alarmed.
I mean, I wasn't really that shocked. Like, to me, this kind of seems regular now. Like, it does seem like every year or so we get one of these warnings, whether it be from the IPCC or from like the UN climate change report or something like that, where we are all doomed. I feel the climate apathy, which I think is something that's really setting in amongst a lot of people, because it is baked in now. Like, we will experience climate change. We are experiencing climate change, and it will only get worse for the foreseeable future, for the next few decades. Even if tomorrow every government in the world began a radical decarbonisation program, we would still see at least 20-30 years of heightened, like we're seeing right now, flooding, wildfires, sea level rises. We will see that for the next 20 to 30 years at least, and it's probably going to be for the rest of the century, if not worse. And if I feel apathetic because I'm sort of getting used to the shocks now, the government, just all governments just don't seem to. It's just just knock that to the end of the desk. That's just another one, stick it on the pile. So yeah, as much as it is obviously alarming, and it's another thing to add to the fear. I am sort of a bit getting used to the fear now. It's just part of my psyche when it comes to thinking about these things.
What was your reaction, Declan?
Yeah, I know exactly what Tom means by that. There's been a lot more media coverage of this topic, particularly in the last 10 years, and I think that does play a role in that. People do almost get used to that and just accept that, which is really sad in a way. That's exactly what we shouldn't be doing. But on the other hand, I do think people now are more aware of what's going on, perhaps than ever before. So I guess I'm a little bit more hopeful in the fact that people know what's going on. They may be more inclined to do something about it. I don't think we've necessarily seen that at the moment, but it's certainly something which we've got to hope that's the situation's going to unravel. One thing which really struck me was just that there didn't seem to be much reaction from governments around the world as well. We all have our individual targets. Governments have set targets. The UN has a target as well, but they don't seem to have shifted with this new report, which basically has said that there's no doubt that there's human involvement in the climate change, that the 1.5 degree warming is very likely now within the next 20 years. I think most people know that's going to cause disastrous consequences. Most governments know that. But yeah, we still haven't adjusted our targets, and it's something that we could really regret, to be honest. I think if we don't take an urgent look at those targets now, for example, our net zero emission targets, and radically change them, then we are going to feel the consequences, unfortunately.
Of course, the UK government has pledged to be carbon neutral by 2050. That's been enshrined in law. Whether it happens remains to be seen. The Chinese government has pledged to be carbon neutral by 2060, which, according to some estimates, would be too late, especially with a country as large as China. China being one of the world's top 3 emitters, and I think I'm right in saying it is the number 1 emitter of greenhouse gases at the moment, along with the United States and India. So, there needs to be mass action from governments, that's for sure. And it is one thing I often object to, is sort of a lot of governments saying, be more green yourself, go vegan, or recycle more and things like that. Placing the onus on the individual like that isn't the right message. What we need to be talking about is action from government, action from big polluting corporations. That's where most of the emissions are coming from. That's what we need to see. That's where we need to see action.
Can I slightly disagree with you on that?
Sure.
Yeah.
A bit of disagreement.
Yeah, I mean, I totally get what you mean. And corporations and governments really don't play that part. And, the way to get ourselves out of this crisis is by getting them to play that part. And I'm totally with you on that. I think that's bang on the money. But we do have an individual responsibility as well. I think the idea when we say that, we should place all the blame with these corporations, I don't think that's quite right. I don't think it's fair that, we can all just, sort of use and abuse, for want of a better phrase, the planet that we have. A number of people still don't do basic things like recycling. A lot of people in our big cities overuse things like cars when they really don't need to, when they could walk to a place or they could take a bicycle. A lot of people eat excessive amounts of meat. And, I don't want to be sort of saying like, everyone should go vegan tomorrow and, walk to work and everything like that, because, being realistic, our world doesn't work that way. A lot of people need that car. A lot of people have grown up for years and years eating, 2 meals that have meat in them every day, if not 3. So, I understand it's not easy, but I do think there's a responsibility for everyone. We can't just say, okay, let's all blame the corporations. No, everyone has to say, look, I need to do my bit as well, and we need to focus on those corporations. One thing I've seen recently actually popping up about this topic is the idea of placing a higher tax on carbon. So, companies that do produce the most carbon, tax them for it. And that's possibly one way that we could get them to, immediately change how much carbon they're putting out. At the end of the day, if it hits their profit, that could be a bigger incentive for them. Maybe the same for, for people too. Would that be a big incentive for people to drive less, to make these small changes? So that's an interesting idea as well.
And I think that's one of the problems we saw in France, though, which sparked the Gilets jaunes protest, was that extra fuel tax, which frankly I think was a regressive tax. It's putting the onus on the people at the bottom to make them foot the bill for climate change instead of the big polluting companies. And I take your point about, people we should be transitioning away from individual transport as much as we can and towards more sustainable diets. At the same time, it's hard to blame individual people for that when the infrastructure isn't necessarily there for them to be able to do it, such as with electric cars and public transport. If you live anywhere vaguely rural in this country, it's hard to get by without a car. And even then,
but what's the excuse for people in a city like Manchester, where I live? Because if anyone's ever been to Manchester, you'll know how congested Manchester city centre is most days of the week. And you see, I was walking through town today, and you see so many cars with 1 person in them and 4 empty seats. And you're just like, do you, all you people really need to use your car to drive 2 minutes up the road to the supermarket and come back?
Yeah,
probably not.
Even in London, which has obviously got the best public transport in the country, you still see people driving around central London who have the money, because obviously there are those pushes in London with the congestion charge. You still see people driving around in SUVs in zone 1, and you're like, what are you doing? So I do take your point about, is stuff like fuel taxes. It is a regressive tax, because obviously it will probably stop poor people from driving, potentially stop people that need to driving, mean that people who have disabilities don't leave the house because they're like, I can't afford to run the car that got me out of the house anymore because of these taxes to help fight climate change. But for the people that live in Chelsea, they can just pay that extra bit of money because it's nothing to them. But I would potentially see maybe like some kind of midpoint between the two arguments about it being on the onus of the government and the onus of the corporations, and also the onus of the people. Because if you use government to, say, tax these corporations on carbon, as you suggested, and then you use that money to build cycle paths or to invest in like lab-grown meat, you know, to make that cheaper for the, you know, because if it's there and it's cheap, if it's the same price, if not less than meat, then more people might be willing to try it. And you know, if it's easy to cycle into your workplace, then you might do it. There was tragically, I don't cycle to work, and one of the reasons I've been put off doing it very recently is because tragically someone was hit by a lorry just around the corner from where I work on a bike in central London, and she's passed away. And you know, if I'm thinking, oh God, I don't want to drive into cycling to central London now, you know, there's going to be other people that think that as well. And obviously that's just a matter of public safety. So yeah, there's definitely a middle ground between your 2 points there.
For sure. And yes, I think, like I say, that's the point. You know, there needs to be that infrastructure for people to do it, and there need to be those incentives. I talk to so many people who say, you know, I'd like to have an electric car, but they're just too expensive. And where am I going to charge it? And,
yeah,
I'd like to use public transport, but I just live too far away from work.
Yeah, and public transport isn't great.
Yeah,
it's that old-fashioned argument about, oh well, you wouldn't be poor if you had a bit of money to begin with. I could buy a pair of boots that would last me all through the winter, but I won't because I don't have that money to begin with. You know, you hear people talk about, oh well, the savings you make because you don't have to buy, you know, fuel is obviously not as expensive if you're charging your car. But then people, I don't have that money to begin with. And the obvious answer is just, you know, make more grants for electric cars so that anyone that wants one can buy one. But you know, they're waiting for the market to rectify the situation, and we all know how that works out.
Perhaps we should bring back the scrappage scheme so people can have their old cars scrapped, but they have to buy an electric car with that. Well,
that probably wouldn't be a bad idea.
Yeah, absolutely. But yes, so that was a brief summary of some of the news, along with a spirited debate there about solutions to climate change. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. We're going to try and make these a regular fixture, a weekly show, just a brief 20-minute, half an hour roundup of some of the latest news and a bit of a discussion. But thank you, everyone, for tuning in once again. Please like and subscribe, and follow us on social media. Consider supporting us on Patreon if you like. You know, we would feel good if you gave us $1 a month or something like that. But until next week, thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you all soon.